in the paper and in his speeches, Malcolm insisted, just like Elijah Muhammad, that the NOI did not want integration. Does that mean they're okay with segregation laws?
Yes.
They are not.
No.
Right. So segregation is done by law. Separation is done how? By choice. Right. So they absolutely want to end every segregation law. And in that way, they're just like the NAACP, right? But after that, what does the NAACP want?
Legally.
Right, they want black and white people to do everything together like human beings, right? The NOI wants to get rid of those laws and wants black people to willingly stay separate. And this makes sense from their philosophical viewpoint, because why would you want to get into a swimming pool with devils, right? Doesn't really make sense. Malcolm would sometimes set up on street corners in the Harlem or in Paradise Valley in Detroit, and the NOI would just set up a little speakers platform, microphone, PA system, and Malcolm just starts talking, and a crowd would gather around. And are these people in the crowd members of the NOI?
No.
They are not. They're just people who've come to listen to this charismatic, compelling figure. And this is just a little taste of Malcolm on a street corner. Malcolm says, they call Mr. Muhammad a hate teacher because he makes you hate dope and alcohol. They call Mr. Muhammad a black supremacist because he teaches you and me not only that we're as good as the white man, but better than the white man. What does the crowd do at that point?
Yeah.
The crowd kind of laughs and people are elbowing each other like, what the hell did he just say? Yes, better than the white man. You are better than the white man. And that's not saying anything. That's not saying you're nowhere just to be equal with him. Who is he to be equal with? You look at your skin. You can't compare your skin with his skin. Why, your skin looks like gold beside his skin. You find that old pale thing laid out in the sun, trying to get to look like you, that old pale thing. And for people who have been told, like we've talked about so many times, that black is ugly, black is something to try to get away from. You want to lighten your skin and straighten your hair. This was empowering. That doesn't necessarily mean it's productive, right? To build a kind of superiority complex of your own, but it was empowering to people. So Malcolm's influence went far beyond just the NOI. Privately, Malcolm disagreed with several parts of the NOI doctrine. Does he say so publicly? No, because you can't contradict Elijah Muhammad. But privately, Malcolm, it appears, never fully embraced the idea that white people were literally devils. He could never quite wrap his mind around that as literal truth. But, did you know that from listening to him? No. The other big point of disagreement, and again, he never says this publicly, is that he believed that black people needed to vote. And the NOI's position was that politics was useless. Because who controls the whole political system? The devils. Right. So Malcolm disagreed about that too. He thought that black people not only needed the right to vote, but they had to use it.
I'm surprised he had a problem with the white devil thing, because they killed his father.
And that's why Abi's description was pretty good, really. Like he basically believed that white people in America did lots of evil things, lots of devilish acts. But that's not quite the same thing as being brought up from the pits of hell.
Can you say something about political NOI said?
The NOI says black people should not vote.
Oh, okay.
But Malcolm privately believed they should. In the late 50s, Malcolm went on a tour of Africa. Remember, this was right in that period where African nations were getting their independence, one by one. And Malcolm was trying to link together black people's freedom struggle in America with African people's freedom struggles. Just like who had 30-some years ago? Garvey. Right, just like Garvey, trying to link the struggles together. He also was spending time trying to get other countries outraged about what was happening in the U.S. And who doesn't like that?
White supremacists. The U.S. government.
The government.
Yeah, the U.S. government doesn't like that. Right? We saw what they did to Paul Robeson and Du Bois. This entire NOI movement that was growing during the 1950s was not in the South. It was in the cities of the North and the Midwest, primarily. And that meant that most Americans didn't know about it. Did most Americans really spend time getting to know the east side of Cleveland? No. That changed in 1959. In 1959, CBS produced a documentary called The Hate That Hate Produced, which was like an expose of the Nation of Islam. What do you think was the meaning of that title?
That we were, like, white people, like, hated them and enslaved them and did that to them, so we made them hate us back.
That's exactly the idea. It was really coming from a kind of liberal, northern viewpoint, that it was white people's hatred that had produced this movement among black people, which they see as a hate movement. This was a multi-part documentary. It aired on multiple nights, and it was a big hit. This was back when there were only 3 networks, so you only had 3 channels to choose from. But it was a big TV hit. And for the first time, people outside of these black neighborhoods had heard of the Nation of Islam and were talking about the Nation of Islam. And what did most Americans think of them?
The radicals?
Radical, un-American traitors. Right. So now, we're heading back down to the South, leaving the NOI for a while, and heading back down to the South. Now remember when we were here before, King had formed SCLC, remember after the Montgomery campaign? And what did SCLC start doing on black college campuses?
Fundraising?
Come and go and teach them not to be violent.
Right, remember they were running those non-violence workshops on all these black college campuses in the South. And fundraising too, but really trying to train kids in non-violence. At North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, these 4 young men were sitting in their dorm room. They were all freshmen at this school, the full name of which is here on their seal.
North Carolina A?
The full name of which is North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. The important part from that is, what kind of school is it?
Black.
It was black college. Trade school?
It's a trade school, right. It is first and foremost a trade school. It is part of the network of schools that had been set up by who?
The guy of Chickadee? No.
Who?
The guy who formed Chickadee.
Who's that guy?
Booker T. Washington?
Booker T. Washington. Right.
But it's the name of school, right?
Tuskegee.
Tuskegee. Oh.
You had the letters right. So it's one of those trade schools that go all the way back to Booker T. Washington's vision from the late 1800s. And I always think that that's important to point out. Because remember, Washington's strategy was that we as black people need to spend some time getting educated and getting some wealth. And then he said, 1, 2, 3 generations from now, we'll count on them to get equality. And in a way, it's kind of like that's what's happening. We are here generations later. These 4 young men, as I said, they were freshmen, and they had all taken part in one of those SCLC nonviolence workshops. So they were looking for a way to use what they had learned, to put it in action. And they decided to go down to the Woolworths in downtown Greensboro and try to get a cup of coffee. What's a Woolworths? Yeah, it's like a drugstore / department store. And Woolworths is gone today, which is why it needs explanation. But at the time, it was the biggest drugstore chain in the country. And actually, the other big chains from the time are mostly gone today too. And they've been replaced, with Walgreens and CVS everywhere. But if you imagine in your Walgreens or CVS that in the back of that drugstore was a little lunch counter. And so people waiting for a prescription or people shopping could go into the drugstore and sit down at the lunch counter and get a meal, breakfast or lunch, pretty quick, decent food. At all of these Woolworths and the other drugstores in the South, black people were not allowed to sit at the lunch counters. Were they allowed to shop at the stores?
Yes.
Yes. So they would let black people shop at the stores. The cashier would take your money, cuss at you a little bit, but they wouldn't let you sit at the lunch counter. What's the difference?
Because white people would have to serve them.
Right. At the lunch counter, white people would have to be serving black people. And what is it you give to the waiter to tell them what you want? Orders. Black people would be giving white people orders. And white people would then be serving black people. So that was too much. You could shop at the drugstore, but not sit at the lunch counter. They get dressed up in their Sunday best, because they don't want to, they want to look good. They all went into the Woolworths and bought something to establish what?
Was it rare?
Right, we are paying customers, right? So they all buy something, and then they go back and sit on 4 stools at the lunch counter. And the white woman behind the counter looked at these 4 young men like aliens had just landed. She looked at them like, and she just backed away and went to get the manager. And the manager comes over and he says, you boys can't sit here. And they said, we're American citizens. We believe that any person should be able to get service at this lunch counter. And the manager said, well, you're not going to get any service. And they said, well, that's fine. We'll study. They'd brought their books from school, and they got out their books and spent the afternoon in nervous study. They stayed there until the store closed that night. And the manager came back and said, now look here, boys, the store's closing. You got to get out of here now. And they stood up and prepared to leave. But one of them, 18 years old, said to the manager, we will be back tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. And we will be here at this lunch counter every day until any American can get service at this lunch counter. And he put his finger down on the lunch counter, and he looked at the manager, and he said, the movement for human dignity begins right here at this lunch counter.